Chapter 9. Scouting the Salvation Republic. The Monocular and the Rifle. A plan. Shoots a captive. Gets chased. Close call. 1997. The mist clung like rot to the tree line above their camp and would not leave. It hung there in the boughs like something watching, and the camp itself laid out in the lowland gully like the husk of some forgotten industry. Spread out with its patchwork walls and its scattered fires, and the floodlights swept in rhythmic arcs over the ramshackle watchtowers and the peeling cabins with their old brass numbers still affixed like teeth in the gums of the past. Some fool thought it strategic, or maybe nostalgic. A summer camp turned prison. The irony of the thing was so thick there was no use in even speaking of it. Wooden palisades rose where once were children's laughter and merit badges, and they were rotted through and lashed with barbed wire and sheet metal and old fencing peeled off defunct ranches. And the lights had been mounted on rusted scaffolding, all buzzing and flaring with the gutted insides of old gas generators. And down below in the muck sat the pens. Chicken wire and pallets and old railroad ties all clapped together into crude corrals. And inside these cages were men and women stripped of dignity with faces the color of ash, and starved and swollen with insect bite, and black-eyed with mud up to their knees, and some looked to the floodlights as if they might be something holy. The guards of the Salvation Republic were uniform only in their deformity, with mismatched armor and dyed scraps of old riot gear and football pads and leather belts buckled over bare torsos. Some wore armbands fashioned from children's school clothes, and others bore stitched patches of their red sunburst flag, dyed with blood or rust. And their hair was matted and sheared in no ritual way, just whatever madness passed through a blade. And they chewed weeds and muttered prayers to no god in particular. The Salvation Republic had the air of sanctimony, but it was made from the cloth of brigands. They made converts at the point of a blade and called it redemption. And they killed in the name of order, but order was just a word sewn on a corpse. And so the watchers from the trees, the man and the woman, crouched in the black soil and watched this pathetic simulacrum of justice unfold. And they themselves, murderers and pillagers both, bore no illusion. The man had cut throats in the name of much less, and the woman had left mothers in alleys to die in silence. And yet now they crouched as saviors for blood or kin only, and even that only barely. For what was kin in a world such as this was a mirror to shame or madness. Bud and Freedom were up on a ridge of landscape that was lush with foliage, and the brush was thick and wet with the sweat of the darkness. And down below the lamb dropped off toward the camp, and smoke rose from it in slow turns. Freedom lay prone in the grass, and the monocular in her hand was a scuffed black thing she'd taken from Talon's room, and it was still etched with someone else's name half scratched off. She brought it up to her eye again, and her breath slowed like something trained in the act of killing. "I see him," she said. "Where at?" Bud said. He looked over at her, and his voice was low, and his eyes then locked on the dim glow of the floodlit camp, squinting down into the bowl of the trees and firelight. "In that second pen. They got him hauling some buckets round, and he don't look good," she said. "Fuckers." "Well, I guess today's his lucky day," whispered Bud. He looked down at the camp again, and then back up at Freedom, and he stared for a time like he'd think of something far off. And after a while, "Will you gimme that damn thing if you ain't gonna spit out what you seemed?" he said. "2 towers," said Freedom, absent like her mind was drifting. 3 armed men, 2 on one tower, 1 on the other. And they switched about every 20 minutes, far as I can judge. Bud shifted and looked down again. "You take out the guards on the tower from afar. I'm going in and tearing it up," he said. "North fence is the weakest," Freedom continued. "Most rotted wood I ever seen, and the least guards." "You better stay here and cover me," said Bud. "I ain't gonna go down there until you took down at least one of them rats up there." "I aim to," said Freedom. And she set the monocular with the left hand now and picked up the rifle slow, shouldered it with one arm. She breathed once, then twice, and the shadows didn't move, and the light swung its pendulum arcs over the fence and back again, and she'd look down the monocular as if it were the scope of the rifle itself, with that long weapon sitting there in the brush in her free hand, and she'd aim it with no support and no guideline, and around her was only stillness along the ridge. The leaves and roots like some silent congregation around her, and in that awkward position she still found herself able to shoot heads point blank. The first man in the tower lit a cigarette, and his skull opened mid-sentence, and red gore and brains came out like some unruly current, and then down the front of the man before he fell. The shot cracked across the forest like a whip, and he fell like a sack of wet laundry, and now his misshapen head only bubbled and gurgled strangely, with only a section of his jaw left attached. The second turned and tried to shout something, but the round took him in the teeth, and he tumbled over the railing and hit the ground below and didn't move. The last one had been walking in circles, and didn't even know the others were dead. She adjusted, fired, and he crumpled as if a rope had been cut inside him. Bud stood at the edge of the ridge like some revenant rose from clay, and the sawed-off was loose in his hands, and tucked like a secret in the small of his back, he had brought a Beretta 70. His boots were caked in ash, and his eyes held nothing. Behind him he had looked back and saw Freedom adjust herself, and it had caused the monocular to reflect the firelight back at him, and it casted a sort of odd lens flare. Bud came down the slop in a low half-run, and his weapon laid against his thigh, shoulders forward. A hunter moving into smoke. He came through the wild grass without noise and into the camp like a fever, and the men had not heard the shots or they had not understood them. Men were frozen at fires, still cooking meat, and prisoners were sobbing from the pens, and the place smelled of beef tallow and sweat. A guard turned and stood in the dirt road with a rifle half raised, mouthing a question that never found breath, and Bud leveled the sawed-off and split his chest open with both barrels. The man was lifted off his boots and carried backward through the air and struck the side of a shack with such force it buckled. Another came running, and Bud cast the empty shotgun down and drew the Beretta, sighting with only one hand, and he fired once into the collarbone and again through the bridge of the nose, and the man fell backward without a sound. Smoke from the fire curled up past them, and Bud had vanished into it. A third man stumbled out of a barrack and half-buttoned fatigues, and Bud met him blade to blade, and they circled crabwise. The man had thrusted the rusty knife toward him, and he had parried with the pistol and then lunged and caught his arm. Then he drove it through beneath his rib cage, and around Bud men were shot in head and body by freedom, and they tottered and dropped. Throughout the dark air, gunshots from pistols and rifles rang out, and prisoners and guards yelped alike like wounded animals, and residents had panicked, some running wildly and naked or in briefs, and Salvation Republic guards looked wildly with hands like visors over their eyes and some meager attempt to spot freedom. They were not prepared for this. 2 guards rounded the corner of the fence, rifles lifted, and he shot the first in the eye and the second in the throat, and they fell against each other and into the dirt like lovers. From the pens, the prisoners screamed and clawed at their fences, and Bud glanced once and saw Liberty hunched low in the second pen. And he ran low past the cooking fires and fired again, the Beretta cracking like a whip. Another guard downed, a hand blown clean off at the wrist, and another shot, and his spine snapped backwards, the man twitching like a bug on a plate. He dropped behind a stack of crates and reloaded with a dancer's speed while bullets flew and ricocheted off wood. Some shot at him and some shot at nothing. Blood was already thick on his knuckles. And from behind a cook tent, a man came with a knife, and Bud met him and caught the wrist mid-swing and drove the Beretta's barrel up through the man's chin and pulled the trigger. The top of his head bloomed open like a red flower, and he collapsed soundlessly. He picked up a length of rebar from the mud and swung it like a club, crushing a man's temple and sending him spinning into the firelight, the rebar slick with blood. A guard lunged from the shadows, and Bud met him bare-handed and caught him by the collar and drove his head 3 times against the steel bars of a pen until the bone gave away and the face peeled. And all around him guards and captives alike were dropping, and men sat over their rifles fiddling with them while blood ran from their ears, and knelt over almost as if they were in prayer. One of them trying to scramble and pick up a rifle with his left arm blown off and only 2 fingers left on the right. And Bud threw a flashbang into the far corner of the camp where more guards were amassing, and the light punched the night, and screams rang out louder. He kicked one man's knee backward and stomped his throat flat in the mud. And another rose swinging, and Bud fired the Beretta into his chest point blank. 3 shots, and his body twisted like a flag in wind and folded. Bud had made his way over to the pen opposite to Liberty and tossed another flash into their corral, and it detonated in the midst of them, and they hit the ground sobbing and disoriented. The guards near them screamed and staggered, and Bud shot 2 before they could raise their weapons. He ran low, breathing like a bull, with blood on his neck and his shirt torn open, and he leapt the split fence and drove his boot into another man's spine, and he pulled a knife from the bed and used it to slip the belly of a man reaching for his gun. And the guts came like worms from a broken pouch, and Freedom dropped from the ridge and joined him. She stabbed a man in the back and twisted, and her face spattered with blood, and she laughed as if it were all a game. A woman gone too long in the dark. They moved together now, a rhythm to their slaughter. She shot a man's kneecap out, and Bud finished him with a blade to the heart. And a guard begged, and Bud kicked out his legs and caved in his ribs with the rebar. Some of the guards were drunk, and some of the guards had fouled themselves in the chaos, and some of them had trotted brokenly into their own sharp wooden spokes and killed themselves. And everywhere the dying groaned and croaked and twitched in the dead grass, which was now painted a slick coat of red. The sky was a great black lid pressed down over the earth, and the world beneath it lay almost quiet now but for the dying and the wind. Smoke still lifted from the fires nigh to burning up, and bodies lay strewn like wind-fallen limbs. They wore the faces they died with. Some were eyeless, Some had no mouths left to scream. A shot went wild and a girl was hit. A lean Republic guard, bleeding already from the side, had risen up from behind the water trough and loosed a single round, and the bullet passed Budsworth and caught the woman in the hip. And she went down like something folding. Hair of pale gold wet with blood, and writhing on the dirt floor, and her hands clawing at nothing. Bud turned and raised the shotgun and fired, and the guard's head came apart like fruit dropped from a height. The water and blood inside raining down like some sort of tears from some blood moon, and the wall behind was painted red and gray. A ribbon of meat clung for a moment to a rusted horseshoe nailed to the post before it too fell. Smoke cleared, and Bud's eyes landed on the girl. She'd looked up at him through a mask of pain and dust, and in her face was something strange. Not just fear or thanks. As if she believed he had done it for her. As if this butcher with the shotgun had become in that instant her savior. And she went on to give him a look that could only be described as an implication that she would let him live her entire life for her, just if at once it kept her safe. That look. "Don't get all excited," said Bud. "I ain't did that for you." He turned, and across the corral he saw Liberty in chains. And he was tied like some hog to the pen rails, and Freedom crouched beside him with a long knife sawing through the binds. Bud moved to them without another glance at the woman, and the black smoke curled behind him like some veil separating man and woman, and the fires crackled and whispered obscene things into their ears. Freedom had the knife, and Bud had his hands, and between the two of them they worked the cords free off of Liberty. Freedom with short mechanical strokes at the knots, and Bud wrenching at the bindings like a man pulling someone limb from limb. Liberty was groaning low with each tug, and the rope bit into his skin, and his face was sick with pain, but he bore it. At a certain point she had stopped cutting, and Bud felt it before he saw it. Her hands no longer moving. He looked up, and her eyes had gone cold, fixed on something behind him. A figure broke from a line of cages, ambiguous whether it was a captive or a guard, and he was thin and wild-eyed and limping fast toward them through the smoke, and was unarmed. Freedom drew up her rifle smooth as anything and shouldered it and fired once, and the sound of the shot was deafening in the open, and the man's head came apart and flowered open and appeared as a ring of red fire before he fell sideways and rolled once. Liberty howled. "No," he said. "No!" He writhed against the ropes and then against Bud's grip, and Bud stood looking at him, and the last of the bindings were slack in his hands. "Freedom, what the fuck? You shot him!" Liberty cried. "You shot him!" Bud turned on him then. "What are you screaming about?" He seized the man by the arm again and began to drag him toward the tree line, and the pen behind them smoldered and burned, and it looked as if you could almost see the dying's ascending souls rise up through the red-hued smoke. "That was my fucking friend," Liberty cried. "What's wrong with you?" Freedom stood still and her eyes narrowed, and she looked once at Liberty, then down to the man she'd killed, then back again. "Didn't seem like no friend the way he was running at me," she said. "He weren't running at you, Freed. He was running to me." He covered his eyes with one hand like he meant to shut out the world. "I've been in here 6 months with him. He was all I had." He continued in a tone broken by sorrow. She didn't answer. They were already halfway across the yard, and Bud had Liberty by the arm, and the man was dragging his heels, but Bud never slowed. Freedom fell in behind them without a word. Liberty yanked again, but Bud's grip was an iron vise. Bud looked back over his shoulder. "We're saving your life, kid, and I ain't doing it 'cause I wanna, so shut up." Liberty clawed and pulled at Bud's hand again, and with the strength of a full grasp, managed to pry Bud's index finger off of his wrist. Bud dropped him, and the momentum carried Liberty backward, and he hit the earth hard and rolled and coughed. Bud moved with no pause, reached down and seized the back of his shirt and began to drag him again. "Thank you, Freed, for saving my life," mocked Freedom, a voice like a dry well, no amusement or warmth in it, and Liberty said nothing. Bud stopped and looked down at him with some strange mix of fury and fatigue, and he bent and hoisted him bodily and set him on his feet. "Come on, get on your feet. You're free," he said. Then, with something almost like kindness, he clapped the man on the shoulder. "Enjoy it." Liberty stood there dazed and did not answer. They made their way to the rusting car, half buried in soot and dead leaves now. Liberty slumped in the back seat, and Freedom climbed in beside the driver, and Bud sat behind the wheel. He started the car, and the engine growled low, and they pulled out of the village with the night stretching wide about them like the mouth of some great cave. The sky had turned to soot, and there were no stars nor moon still. The road beneath them was cracked and pocked with the old erosion of time, and on either side the brush and ruined signage of a time before was set before them like relics of some ancient time. On the side a telephone pole leaned like a drunk, with a shoe nailed to a fence post. It was a child's shoe, curled like a dead leaf. It hung like a relic or a warning, some mute witness to something older than the trespass of men. No shoe ends up nailed to a post by accident. You'd have to stop your car. You'd have to take out your hammer and your nail and hold that small ruined thing in one hand and press it there against the dead wood and drive the spike home. And in the epochs where clocks meant nothing, where there were no names for the days nor the moons, man still left his mark in whatever way he could. In the bones piled in the mouths of caves, in the soot-scrawled walls, in a shoe nailed to a fence post, long after both the fence and the path it flanked had ceased to serve any purpose but bearing witness. These were the monuments of the nameless. And yet this world had gone strange a long time ago. Sun pulled down out of the sky like a curtain torn, and stars quit their posts, and machines rusted in place, and the language of men had gone to grunts and blood and the flat bark of rifles. And yet there was the shoe. As if even the senselessness of the world required some totem, some shrine, a thing that made no sense in a world that no longer asked for any. Behind them came light, pale at first, then brighter. Headlights. Freedom looked back. Yep, here's their backup. Bud's grip on the wheel tightened. Liberty, stay down. Don't get any bright ideas, he said. And Freedom reached back with one arm and snagged the rifle off the seat and checked the magazine and slapped it in place. Bud unholstered the Beretta and laid it flatwise in his lap as he steered with the free hand. The vehicle gaining on them was a yellow-colored AMC Pacer from a decade long dead. armored clumsily with scrap plate and spot-welded steel. No ram wedge in the front. They'd meant to shoot them, not smash them. Muzzle flashes came like fireflies in a dream, and then the sound caught up. Bud swerved hard left, and the tires kicked up gravel and dust, and he drifted along the shoulder and then right again. A shot punched through the rear window with a sound like a bottle breaking. Freedom turned in her seat and leaned out and opened fire. From the flank came the low chuffing cough of a motorcycle, and the rider was a black silhouette in leather and chrome. He raised a stubby Smith & Wesson that gleamed in the moonlight, but never fired it. Freedom dropped him before he could, and the bike went down like a wounded thing and slid across the blacktop and sparked until it stopped somewhere in the horizon. The pacer swerved again and missed the body by inches. Still it came. Freedom braced the rifle and fired again. The windshield cracked like ice, and the man in the passenger seat took a round through the throat or jaw and slumped out the window, and his head went whoosh, whoosh, whoosh in the wind like a grotesque fruit on a string. The road ran out behind them in long black ribbons flayed by heat and silence and the bodies they'd left on it. And the passenger in the pacer slumped over like a gutted deer, and the driver bore down hard, grill teeth barred, and yellow hood bucking like a dog pulling at its chain. In the fractured mirror, Bud saw the door behind the driver edge open, and a hand slipped through like the limb of a man being born. Then the rest of them. A dark figure clambered onto the roof of the pacer, hunched like some black and alien insect. He moved low to the metal with his feet scrambling, and one gloved hand curled tight over the roof rack, and the other brandishing an 8mm pistol with some kind of extended muzzle. The car behind jostled and surged, but the man held. He gained his footing and leapt across the gulf between machines, and his boots struck the duster with a hollow clunk, and then he was on top of them. Freedom's eyes in the glass. Liberty's breath sharp in the back seat. Bud swerved, but the man gripped the frame like he was nailed to it. A man that maybe left his sense at the door when presented with the prospect of presenting Budsworth Rossland's head to his leader. A fur trapper's hat crowned his head, coarse and lusterless, sewn from some red fox. The man crouched low and moved toward the driver's side, and his pistol glinted silver in the hard nightlight. And Bud watched him in the side view. The long barrel swept past the glass. Freedom had frozen, her hands braced on the dash. The car behind them narrowed the distance, now a closing predator. "Hold on," Bud said, and he slammed the brake pedal with both feet, and the duster shrieked to a halt, and Freedom's shoulder slammed the dash, and Liberty was thrown into the footwell. The pacer behind them collided and exploded forward with the shriek of warped steel and the slam of broken glass. The windshield shattered like old ice, and the driver, flung by the momentum of vengeance unmet, came hurling through it, and his body pitched and landed across the back of their vehicle with the thump of meat on metal. The man on the roof went sailing. He hit the road with his arms cartwheeling and his hat coming loose in the air, and his spine bent wrong and his body rolled under the front end of the still racing pacer. There was a wet, snapping crack, and then the tires rose and fell with a lurch and the sound of bones. Freedom's rifle flew backward into the cab and landed beside Liberty, who'd drawn up like a child in the dark. And Bud pulled the gear shift forward and stomped the gas. The duster groaned and surged, dragging the front end of the pacer several yards until, with a loud metallic tear, it came free. The wrecked machine slumped back like a man who'd been pushed too far. Its hood crumpled, the grille torn sideways. the whole vehicle now with a visage akin to some devilish smile. Bud hit the brakes again, and in the mirror the driver moved. He crawled up from the road as if dragged by some unseen hand, arms weak, ribs showing. Blood ran down his shirt. He pulled from his belt a revolver with some sort of shaved barrel, and he raised it in trembling protest. Bud shifted to reverse. The duster bucked again and slammed into the wreck behind them with a roar, and metal folded, and the man's body had been pinned between them and crushed with a horrible scream. Bud didn't let up. Smoke screamed off the tires, and the man writhed, his bones turning to meal inside him. And still he lifted the revolver, shaking and blind with pain. Freedom grabbed her AR and aimed backward, pulled the trigger. Click. "Give it to me," Liberty said. "Give it to me." He tore the rifle from her hands after she'd offered it and unseated the mag and slapped in a fresh one from the back seat, the sound of it snapping in place. The man screamed one last time and raised the revolver high. Liberty leaned out from the back seat and fired. The shots ripped the air, and the man's body spasmed and collapsed, and blood washed over the trunk of the duster and then was lost to the wind. They drove on.